from that point of view, but you always have to have some of the Old Testament foundations, because that's where the story or the history of Israel all began, in the Old Testament. Realize that the Bible is dealing with the children of Israel. In other words, it's dealing with God's chosen people. The people that were in despair, but God brought them to delight. It is basically the same thing that basically happens in our life a lot of times. Very often in our life, we find ourselves in despair. But as we look through the highlights of the Old Testament, you can see some of the indications and some of the disobedience that caused the children of Israel to be in despair. You can actually see the fact that God had to call a nation to send Jesus Christ down through in order to bring the nation of Israel, in order to bring us in 2018 from despair to delight. But it all had to begin back in the book of Genesis. You kind of have to have a little bit of the foundation to understand how man actually messed up way back in the book of Genesis, and that disparity passed all the way down through the Old Testament. That's why the New Testament basically is dealing with the delight, because of the fact that God's promise was fulfilled that he made in the book of Genesis 3:15. That promise was fulfilled in the New Testament, and they had a delightful time in the New Testament because of the scripture says that Jesus, the Lord, was in the New Testament. And then the scripture says to delight thyself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Okay? So as we look at Genesis, and you all make sure that you go over this when you get home. Go over this on some home time. Amen. To make sure that when we get to class, we don't have a lot of class time. And really, it takes a while to go through the Old Testament. That's why we are just highlighting some of the most important events in each book in the New Testament, in the Old Testament. Even some Old Testament students, Sister June, Brother Ed, Brother Greg, we have been through the Old Testament probably on several occasions. Because remember now, we have to always remember that sometimes you have to go over something more than once in order to understand it. Okay? That's why you see sometimes we go over the Old Testament and we also go over the New Testament more than once, because you did not get everything the first time. And the Old Testament is not just a one semester study. It's not just a 2 semester study. Unless I just push and push and push. It has to go more than 2 semesters very often in our lives. That's why sometimes we just go through highlighting the Old Testament, because you actually need to get an overview of everything that took place in each book, each chapter in the Old Testament. Remember, we had talked about the 5 law books in the Old Testament. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. And then you went from the law books to your history books. And after you go through the history of the Old Testament, you go through the poetic books. That's where you get Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, Psalms of Solomon from the poetic books. And after the poetic books, you have to realize that you have the prophetic books, okay? Remember, we have the major prophets and the minor prophets. And it's a list of the major prophets and the minor prophets and disposal that are given out over the Old Testament. Because people have to realize when you are looking at the Old Testament as a whole, you have to realize how each book, how each prophet fit into the Old Testament, because as I often teach, sometimes it's like a big puzzle. You have to be able to put the pieces together before you can figure out what the picture look like, okay? So all these are is corner pieces, some center pieces. We're going to put the pieces together so that you can see how the picture look when it's halfway complete, or when it's all way complete. So we dealt with Genesis last week, and week before last, we dealt with some of Genesis. And in Genesis, we found out, even in the book of Genesis, out of the first law books of the Bible, you found out that a man by the name of Moses was responsible for writing the first 5 books of the Bible as we go through the highlights. And some people may challenge you the fact of how did Moses go back into Genesis and write the first 5 books of the Bible when he was not even there at that particular time. Okay? Realize that the information was passed down from before the flood to after the flood, okay? Remember, before the flood, remember you had Noah there, okay? Before the flood. Noah had a picture from his father, from his grandparents, of how history took place from Genesis all the way down to the time of Moses, okay? Moses had a picture because of the descendants of Noah. Noah and them gleaned the information before the flood, and after the flood, Noah and his children was there after the flood. So there was a picture of what had taken place before the flood. So that was passed down from generation to generation, because remember, in those days you had pictorials. They used to write in caves, okay? They would write the information down. They would write the information down on vellum, which was thin pieces of leather. They would write the information down on papyrus, which were leaves that the sap had seeped out of, and they had stuck the leaves together so that they could make a scroll out of the leaves, so they would keep a record of what was going on. So records were kept very meticulously, even in Old Testament times, okay? Hieroglyphics. You have all kinds of records that they kept back then that was passed down. That's probably how Moses got a lot of his information on writing the first 5 books of the Bible, okay? Because of the fact that Moses was one of the people that were trained in the Egyptian courts. He was trained in the Egyptian schools. He was trained under Pharaoh. He was trained in Egypt. So he had some of the best training, okay? He knew how to write. He knew how to read. He knew how to discern. God would use him. God was using him even before he was born, because God had Moses hid out, didn't he? Even when Moses came on the scene, Moses was God's special prophet. And even as we look at the book of the prophets, know that Moses was basically one of God's first prophets, okay? After Abraham. They didn't have prophets back in Abraham's day, okay? The prophets came in during the time of Moses, okay? Moses. So when we look at these, highlighting the Old Testament, and you get your sheets out, so we're going to go over some of this kind of briefly, okay? We talked about the Pentateuch, the Torah, different names that's used for the Old Testament, okay? The Septuagint, which was translated into Greek during the time of Alexander the Great. So we looked at the Old Testament, Genesis, written by Moses. We looked at some of the main characters in the Old Testament. We found out in the Old Testament, chapters 1 and 2 and 3, you find out the main character was a man by the name of Adam. And you keep looking in Genesis, you'll see where another main character was Cain and Abel. And then you keep looking, you see how Seth and Enoch was important in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. And then in the book of Genesis, you also found out where God began to call a nation, or began to recognize that he would need a nation to bring Jesus Christ's bloodline down through. And we see that that man was the name of Abraham, okay? Abraham. And from Abraham we had a man by the name of Isaac. And from Isaac we had a man by the name of Jacob. And from Jacob we had a man by the name of Joseph, even though he had other children. But those are some of the main characters in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. Adam chapter 1 and 2. Then you had when you get to chapters 6, 7, and 8, you see Noah on the scene during that particular time. Then when you get to chapters 12, you see where Abraham comes in after the flood. And then in chapters 21, you see where Isaac came on the scene. In 25, you see where Jacob came on the scene. In chapters 37, you see where Joseph came on the scene, okay? And from Joseph on down through chapters 50, you see what was transpiring before they went to Egypt. When you get to the book of Exodus, Those are basically the highlights, the main events in the book of Genesis. And you can see even in the book of Genesis where man was always in despair in the book of Genesis because of him missing the mark, because of his disobedience to God. He was always missing the mark. And you have to realize even